The rain had not stopped since dawn, turning the entrance to Fort Harrison into a mire of slick earth and puddles that reflected the gray morning sky. General Robert Hayes adjusted his cap as he approached the main gate, irritation tugging at him, because he was already late for a briefing that would set the tone for the rest of the week. Yet as he neared the checkpoint, he noticed a stir among the guards. Two soldiers standing firm, yet speaking in careful, measured tones to a figure that looked out of place. It was a woman, her clothes torn and stained, her hair tangled by wind and weather. To anyone else, she might have seemed another soul lost to hardship, another transient wandering close to the boundaries of a secure base in hope of shelter or food. Robert had seen countless such faces over the decades. Men and women beaten down by circumstance, veterans who could not adjust to civilian life, families with nowhere to go. The guards handled them with firmness, but also with a compassion drilled into every good soldier. Yet something about this woman made him slow his steps. Even before she turned her face toward him, her stance was too straight, her hands held still and visible, her shoulders squared despite the ragged clothing clinging to her frame. It was not the stance of a beggar or a drifter. It was the stance of someone who had worn the uniform once, someone who had trained themselves never to slouch before authority, never to show unease when standing in the open. Sergeant Miller was speaking to her with patient authority, explaining that she could not enter, that civilian agencies in town were better suited for assistance. The woman listened without protest, yet Robert could feel a kind of silent resistance in the way she carried herself. The guards were right to follow procedure, but instinct tugged at him that there was more to this than another request for shelter. As he drew closer, the woman turned at last, and in that instant the morning seemed to tilt beneath him. The eyes that met his were pale and piercing, eyes that locked on his with the weight of memory. They were the same eyes that had stared back at him across the chaos of a battlefield 15 years earlier, eyes that had stayed steady when all else collapsed. Robert felt his breath catch. His mind raced back to a mission that had nearly erased him and every man under his command. A mission gone so wrong that it should have ended in silence and unmarked graves. It had not ended because of her, because of the pilot who had defied orders and flown into a storm of fire to drag them out. He whispered her name before he could stop himself. Emma. The guards glanced at him in surprise, realizing their general knew this stranger. The woman nodded faintly, her voice roughened by years, yet unshakably familiar, as she said his name and reminded him of Operation Iron Ridge. The words struck like a blade of memory through his chest. She had been Captain Emma Ward, call sign Falcon, the finest pilot Robert had ever known. Her skill with a helicopter had been near legendary. Her courage under fire, the stuff soldiers whispered about when comparing the impossible missions they had survived. She had once been immaculate in uniform, proud in bearing, a friend and savior. But the woman before him now was a shadow of that figure. Her hair, once tied neat under regulation, was now loose and wild, her jacket stained and threadbare instead of crisp with insignia. The confidence that had defined her seemed stripped away, replaced with something heavy, resignation or weariness that no soldier should ever carry. Robert waved the guards back, his voice regaining steel even as his heart faltered. He led her away from the gate into a small building where privacy could be found. As they walked, he could hardly reconcile the Emma Ward he remembered with the person beside him now. The rain outside pattered against windows while his mind reeled. 15 years earlier, she had been more than a pilot. She had been the unshakable hand that carried his unit out of death itself. Her helicopter had crashed through fire to reach them, the blades tearing at the air while enemy rounds hammered the earth around. She had shouted above the roar for them to board, given them mere seconds to climb aboard before lifting them back into the sky. The fuselage had been riddled with holes, the controls failing, yet somehow she had kept the machine alive, long enough to clear the ridge and drag them into friendly lines. Robert remembered the sickening lurch of that aircraft as it touched down again, the way men staggered out alive when all logic said they should have died. He remembered Emma standing in the wreckage, calm despite the smoke and blood, her steady eyes scanning each survivor to be sure no one was left behind. That day had earned her medals and praise. But to Robert it had been more than decoration. It had been the moment he understood the measure of her courage and the depth of his debt. She had given him his life, and the lives of 13 others. He had thought her future secured, her career assured. She had been promoted, destined for higher command and respect. Yet now she stood before him, worn down, carrying the scars not of battle, but of years without support. He asked in a voice softer than he intended what had happened to her. The office walls reflected his question back at him, lined with photographs of his own rising career, medals polished, a reminder of the path he had walked while she had fallen. Emma's gaze flicked across those walls and lingered on the symbols of everything she had lost. Her shoulders sagged slightly. Then she drew a breath as if summoning the strength to reveal the story that had dragged her here, to him, at this hour. Her presence was not coincidence, not chance. She had come to the one man who knew the truth of who she had been and what she was still capable of. And Robert Hayes, staring at the woman who had once been his savior, felt the weight of his responsibility press heavier than any uniform he had ever worn. The small office where they sat seemed to carry two different worlds within its walls. On one side were Robert's medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights, photographs of promotions and ceremonies that showed a man who had navigated 3 decades of service with rising authority. On the other side sat Emma Ward, her shoulders bent by years that had stripped away not only her rank, but also the simple dignity of stability. For a long moment, neither spoke. Rain tapped against the window. The faint sound of marching boots outside reminded Robert that duty still ticked forward beyond these walls. Yet here sat the woman who had once dragged him and his men from death. And he could not rush her words. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. Emma's voice finally rose, quiet at first, as though the act of speaking carried weight. She told him that much had changed since Operation Iron Ridge. Some choices had been hers, some had been made for her, and together they had pulled her down. Her career had not survived the shift from war to peace, and her life beyond the uniform had not survived the loss of that career. Robert felt the sting in her words. He had seen the transition himself, when combat units were thinned, when combat experience was suddenly less valuable than the kind of credentials suited for training, diplomacy, or peacetime bureaucracy. He had watched good soldiers shuffled out not because they lacked skill, but because the institution no longer knew what to do with them. Yet Emma, Falcon as he remembered, had been one of the brightest. Surely she should have been untouchable. He asked gently what had broken her path, and her eyes hardened as she told him of the accident. A student pilot under her supervision had been killed during a routine exercise. The review board searched for someone to hold responsible, and she became their answer. They said her teaching methods were too aggressive, that her standards had pushed the young trainee too far. The official record marked her as unsafe. Robert clenched his jaw. The Emma he remembered had been meticulous about safety. He had flown with her. He had trusted her to carry his men through fire. The idea that she had been reckless was absurd. Yet in a post-war environment, every misstep became an excuse to reduce numbers, and investigations needed names to blame. Emma explained that the choice had been hers: accept responsibility quietly and leave with some dignity, or fight and risk a court-martial that could have destroyed not only her, but the other instructors involved. She had chosen silence. She had taken the weight onto herself to shield those around her. Robert felt the memory of her courage deepen. This was the same woman who had flown into impossible danger to save others. Now she had sacrificed her own career to save her fellow instructors. Integrity had always been her compass, even when it pulled her into ruin. After the military, she tried to find her place in civilian skies. She sought work with airlines, with charter services, with cargo companies. Yet her record carried the scar of that investigation. Airlines feared her name. Insurance companies rejected her. Doors closed one after another until she found herself scraping together odd jobs, flying here and there for meager pay. She spoke of trying to hold on, working as a flight instructor at small schools, ferrying supplies for companies that paid little and demanded much. Each attempt brought disappointment. Each setback pushed her closer to the edge, until financial strain grew heavy, until poor choices began to weave in her life. A drink at night to quiet the shame, a loan taken with hope of a better contract that never came. Robert's hands curled into fists as she spoke of losing her pilot's license. Medical evaluations cited stress and alcohol. Her apartment slipped away when she could not pay the rent. Her car followed. Eventually, she carried only what fit in a single bag, wandering from city to city. Too ashamed to contact the comrades who once saw her as invincible, she had hidden her fall from nearly everyone. For 3 years she drifted, sometimes finding work for a week or two, sometimes sleeping under bridges, sometimes visiting veteran shelters that reminded her of everything she had lost. Each time she told herself she would recover, but each time the slope grew steeper. Robert listened in silence, his heart heavy. The system had abandoned her. The nation that had pinned medals on her chest had left her to weather storms alone. He felt the injustice burn within him, remembering that she had saved his life when the system could not, and now the system had left her to be forgotten. At last he asked why she had come to him now. Why here? Why this place? Emma looked at him steadily and said she had heard he was stationed at Fort Harrison. She had come because she knew he would remember what they had endured, because she needed someone who understood she was more than a homeless face at the gate. She needed someone who knew she was once Falcon, the pilot who defied death to carry lives out of fire. Her words carried no self-pity. They carried hope, thin and fragile but alive. She asked for a chance to rebuild. She said she needed medical care, a stable place to recover. Most of all, she needed someone to believe she was still capable of more than drifting forgotten. Robert realized then that she was not asking for charity. She was asking for recognition, for the opportunity to prove herself again, to reclaim even a fraction of the dignity stripped from her. She was asking for someone to stand beside her when bureaucracy demanded proof of worth. And Robert Hayes knew that in that moment he could not refuse, for the woman who once saved him from death now asked him to help save what remained of her own life. The air inside the office grew heavy after Emma's words faded. Robert sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing against his chest. He remembered the day on the ridge when she had saved him and 13 men. He remembered how her helicopter had carried them away from certain death. He remembered how he had sworn silently that he owed her his life. Now that debt had come due. He studied her face, worn and lined by years of struggle, yet the same eyes still burned with that steady light. She was not broken, not truly. She had stumbled, yes, but beneath the weary frame still lived the Falcon he remembered, the one who could thread a Blackhawk through gunfire with steady hands, the one who never left anyone behind. Robert stood slowly and said they would not stay in that small office any longer. He told her she would come with him. He guided her through the corridors of the base, the curious eyes of younger officers flicking toward the ragged figure walking beside their general. None of them could have guessed that this woman had once been the savior of soldiers whose names still echoed on plaques of honor. He took her to a quiet lounge used for planning sessions. He ordered coffee for them both. Then he leaned across the table and told her he would help, not with charity, but with every resource the military still owed its veterans. He promised to stand with her through the red tape, through the forms and the waiting rooms, through the endless proof demanded by institutions that had already failed her. Emma's shoulders trembled with relief. She whispered that she would do whatever was required. She said she only needed someone to stand with her when the walls seemed too high. Robert nodded, for he understood that resilience was still hers. She simply needed a hand to steady her first steps. The following days tested them both. Robert began making calls, pulling strings with his rank, pressing old colleagues to look into programs for homeless veterans. He discovered quickly that even generals could not bypass every barrier. The systems were slow, designed more to delay than to act. Each application asked for documentation. Emma no longer had papers lost in years of wandering. He sat with her while they reconstructed her records. He vouched for her service, for her medals, for her history. He told administrators about Operation Iron Ridge, about the impossible rescue she had flown. Some listened with polite indifference, some with surprise, some with skepticism, as if doubting that the woman in torn clothes could be the same pilot whose record they found in dusty files. Emma endured the interviews with quiet strength. She admitted her mistakes without excuse. She spoke plainly about the years she had lost to despair. Yet she also spoke of her will to recover. She said she would accept medical treatment, housing programs, rehabilitation schedules, anything to prove she was more than her circumstances. At night, Robert sometimes found himself unable to sleep. He replayed the memories of her helicopter rising out of the burning valley. He asked himself what would have become of him if she had not come that day. Perhaps he would have been another name etched on a wall of remembrance. His children would never have known their father. His career would have ended in blood and silence. Emma had made all the difference then, and now he was determined to make all the difference for her. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, Emma's world began to shift. She received temporary housing in a veteran shelter. Modest but clean, she began regular medical treatment to address stress and health issues that had stripped away her license. The doctors were cautious, but not without hope. They told her that with time and stability, she could regain her clearances. Robert visited often, sometimes sitting quietly while she rested, sometimes reminding her of stories from their service, stories where her courage had been the difference between life and death. He could see the faintest flicker of pride returning to her eyes as she remembered she had once been more than her hardships. Still, the climb was not smooth. There were days Emma faltered, days when memories clawed at her, when bureaucracy sent letters of denial, when the weight of rebuilding seemed too much. On those days, Robert reminded her that she had once carried him through fire. He told her he would now carry her until she could fly again on her own. Her recovery demanded resilience that most would have surrendered. She endured therapy, training, endless tests. She accepted part-time work assisting at small flight schools, teaching basics while she rebuilt hours of flight time. The pay was little, yet the chance to touch controls again brought life back in her hands. Robert began speaking to others about her. At military gatherings, he told the story of Captain Emma Ward, the pilot who had defied death. He described her heroism not as myth, but as memory. His words began to spread. Slowly, people looked at her not as a drifter, but as a veteran whose name deserved respect. One evening, after a long day of paperwork, Robert and Emma sat outside the shelter under the dim glow of a street lamp. She told him she still feared slipping again, that her past might always shadow her. Robert looked at her and said shadows only exist because of light. He told her she was the light that had once pulled him and 13 men out of darkness, and that nothing could erase that truth. In that quiet moment, Emma felt the fragile spark of belief within her grow. The journey ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in years, she no longer walked it alone. The seasons turned while Emma fought her way through the slow machinery of recovery. Winter gave way to spring, and the air outside the shelter grew warmer. Yet her days were not marked by weather, but by small victories. A form approved, a medical appointment passed, a housing application accepted. Each success felt like a rung on a ladder that had once seemed impossible to climb. Robert stood by her at every step, sometimes as her advocate in offices that doubted her, sometimes as a quiet friend when the day ended and fatigue weighed her down. He reminded her that resilience was not measured in how fast one rose, but in the refusal to remain fallen. Emma listened and carried those words like fuel through the long nights. Her health improved with steady care. She cut away the habits that had once drowned her spirit. Alcohol faded from her life as therapy and structure filled the space it had occupied. Her body grew stronger, her mind steadier. Doctors re-examined her, and after months of diligence, they restored her medical clearance to fly. It was only a provisional step, yet for Emma, it was like breathing again after years underwater. The first time she stepped back into a cockpit, the air itself seemed to shift. It was only a small civilian trainer, nothing like the Blackhawk she once commanded. Yet as her hands touched the controls, a current of memory flowed through her. She felt the hum of the engine, the vibration through her fingertips, and for the first time in years, she remembered who she was. She guided the aircraft through the sky with the same calm precision she had once used in war. Every bank and climb rekindled the part of her soul she thought lost. Robert watched from the ground, his chest swelling with pride. He knew this was not only about flight, but about identity. Emma was more than a woman recovering from homelessness. She was a pilot, always had been, always would be. The sky belonged to her. Soon she was offered part-time work as a flight instructor, guiding young students who dreamed of wings. Her pay was modest, yet her pride was immense. Each lesson reminded her that her knowledge was not gone, Her ability to teach, to steady nervous hands, to pass on the discipline of flight, it all remained intact. Students admired her calm demeanor, unaware that their teacher had once flown into storms of gunfire, unaware that the woman correcting their landings had once carried soldiers out of death. Robert encouraged her to tell her story, but Emma resisted. She said her past was not for admiration. She said she wanted her students to succeed because of their own skill, not because they idolized her. Robert understood, but he also knew that silence often erases heroes. So he began telling her story himself, at gatherings, at conferences, in quiet conversations with colleagues who could open doors. He spoke of Falcon, the pilot who refused to abandon lives. Over time, her reputation slowly returned. Not the polished myth of military days, but the real image of a woman who had fallen and risen again. Veterans organizations began to see her as a model, proof that recovery was possible when support met determination. Invitations arrived for her to speak at small events. At first she hesitated, but Robert urged her forward. He told her that her story was not just her own. It belonged to every veteran who had felt forgotten. Emma's words at those events were humble. She spoke not of medals, but of mistakes, not of glory, but of resilience. She told them that darkness can swallow anyone, but with a hand extended and a will to rise, light could return. Listeners found her honesty disarming. Her voice carried weight, not because of rank, but because of scars carried with dignity. 2 years after she first appeared at the gate, she received an offer from a medical helicopter service. They needed a chief pilot to lead missions that demanded skill, courage, and calm in crisis. The kind of missions where seconds meant lives. Emma accepted. She stepped once more into a life where flight was not just freedom, but purpose. The day she flew her first medical rescue, she felt a rush that echoed the battlefield years. The siren of urgency, the rush to a scene, the weight of lives depending on her hands. She landed on a highway where a wrecked vehicle burned. Paramedics rushed forward, loading a patient on her craft. She lifted into the sky with precision, guiding the helicopter through turbulence as if the years had never stolen her from the skies. When the patient survived, saved by speed and skill, Emma felt something she had not felt in years, pride without shadow. This was why she had flown, why she had endured. She was once again a guardian in the sky, not for soldiers now, but for civilians who needed her in their darkest moments. Robert stood at her side during her promotion ceremony with the service. His voice carried through the hall as he told the gathered crowd of the woman they now called their chief pilot. He told them of the ridge, of the helicopter that should not have survived, of the lives she had carried to safety. He told them that heroism was not a single act, but a choice repeated even when the world turned away. Emma listened, her eyes lowered, yet her heart steady. When she finally spoke, she said Robert had saved her by reminding her that people deserve second chances. She said her career from that moment onward would be spent proving his faith justified. In that moment, the circle closed. The woman once forgotten at a gate now stood again at the front of her field, guiding new pilots, saving new lives. Her story was no longer one of loss, but of return. The years that followed Emma's return to the skies were marked not by headlines or parades, but by steady service. She became chief pilot of the medical helicopter fleet, guiding her team with the same calm confidence that once steadied soldiers under fire. Her aircraft painted white and red replaced the olive-green machines of her past. Yet the mission felt familiar. Lives waited on her precision. Survival depended on her calm under pressure. She flew into storms to carry accident victims to hospitals. She hovered over mountain ridges to lift stranded hikers. She dropped down on highways twisted with wreckage. Each time, she acted with the same clarity that had once defined Falcon in combat. Her courage had not faded with years of hardship. It had been tempered, refined by fire and loss. Robert remained close, watching with quiet pride as she rose again. He attended ceremonies where her team honored her leadership. He sat in the back of conference halls as she spoke to young pilots. His presence was steady, a reminder of their bond forged in the Valley of Death years earlier. He often said that Emma had saved him twice, once from enemy fire and once from despair, when her reappearance reminded him of the duty to never forget those who fall through the cracks. Emma's story spread slowly but steadily. Veteran organizations began to hold her as a model of recovery. Not because her path had been easy, but because it had been brutally difficult. Her failures were as much a part of the lesson as her victories. She showed that even when a system discards someone, dignity can return through resilience and support. Her speeches carried honesty that audiences rarely heard. She told them she had been homeless, that she had made mistakes, that she had known shame, but she also told them that heroism does not disappear when uniforms are stripped away. She said courage sometimes means asking for help, sometimes means accepting it, and sometimes means rising again when no one expects it. Young pilots found her story compelling, not as legend, but as truth. They saw that strength was not perfection but persistence. They learned that even the best can stumble, and that stumbling does not erase worth. Robert often introduced her with words that resonated. He told crowds that Emma Ward had taught him what true heroism meant, not in the skies above a battlefield, but in the long years after. He said courage is not a single act, but a lifetime of rising every time the world tries to push you down. Emma would smile at his words, yet she always redirected attention back to others. She said she wanted her story to stand for every veteran who had slipped through the cracks, for every hero who felt invisible in their struggle. She told them that second chances are not gifts, but bridges, and that with even one hand extended, those bridges can carry people back to purpose. Her work saved hundreds of lives in the years that followed. Families embraced their loved ones because her helicopter had arrived in time. Paramedics praised her steady hand. Students she trained went on to become skilled pilots themselves. The ripple of her recovery spread wider than she could see. On the anniversary of Operation Iron Ridge, Robert and Emma stood together once more. Not in uniform, but in quiet reflection. They visited a memorial where the names of fallen soldiers were etched. Robert laid his hand against the cold stone and whispered that they had survived because of her. Emma replied that she had survived because someone had remembered her worth when she had forgotten herself. The sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the stone. Robert looked at Emma and told her that shadows only exist where light shines. He said she had become that light, not only for him, but for many. Her journey from decorated pilot to forgotten wanderer to chief pilot again had become more than a personal redemption. It had become a story that carried weight far beyond her own life. It reminded communities that the heroes among them can be hidden by hardship, that greatness does not vanish because circumstances crush it, that sometimes the strongest act of courage is simply to rise one more time. For Robert, the lesson was clear. He had once nearly walked past her at the gate, nearly dismissed her as another soul lost to hardship. He would never again make that mistake. He would always remember that behind weary faces might stand someone who once carried lives through fire, someone who still carried within them the power to serve. Emma's name became a symbol within veteran circles, whispered as proof that no matter how far someone falls, the climb back remains possible. She herself never claimed the title of hero. She said she was only a pilot, doing her job. Yet those who knew her understood that her legacy was not just in the flights she commanded, but in the message her life carried. Her story closed not with silence, but with continuation. Every flight she led, every student she taught, every life her team saved became another chapter in a book still being written. The woman once overlooked at a gate had become once more a figure of strength, not polished by ceremony, but burnished by hardship and resilience. And so the legacy of Emma Ward remained, a legacy not of perfection, but of persistence, not of unbroken triumph, but of brokenness reshaped into light, a legacy that whispered to all who heard it that even in the darkest hours, the chance to rise again is never truly gone.